Now that we are, there we go. Now that we are done with logistics, let's get to the exciting part. Welcome again to this first session of our fall series. We are so excited to dive into phonics, phonemic awareness, and fluency with you tonight. And if you don't already know what all of these are, don't worry. That is our goal to learn together today. My name is Molly Maloney, and I am the Director of Policy and Data for our local impact team here at Go Public Schools. And I will be facilitating today's session. Prior to coming to Go, I've worked as a sociologist, as an elementary school ELA teacher, as an instructional coach, and as a data administrator. And literacy is a real passion of mine. So I am so thrilled to get to be with you all today to focus on this important topic. So today we're going to be building on and deepening the work we started last spring in our first literacy learning series. Last May, we heard about the 5 pillars of reading that must be a part of every effective reading instruction program. And these are phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. Can you go to the next slide? There we go. So today we're going to really focus on the first 3 of these: phonemic awareness, phonics, and fluency as foundational reading skills. And then we'll be learning more about those other 2 pillars, comprehension and vocabulary, as well as writing, next week with Natalie Wexler. So more on that later. But today we're going to be learning about best practices for teaching these foundational reading skills in a way that's aligned with the science of reading, or using what's sometimes called a structured literacy approach. We'll also learn a bit about how that differs from some other approaches. And throughout, we'll talk about how to support these foundational literacy skills at home. So now I would love to welcome our panelists. Thank you all so much for taking the time to join us tonight and to share your knowledge. So before we dive into the content, I would love it if you could introduce yourselves, tell us a little bit about yourself, take a minute to tell us about your work and how it connects to our topic today. And we'll end our screen sharing so the audience can all get a chance to see you better. And Beth, why don't you get us started?
Hi, my name is Beth Blair. I live here in the Bay Area. I started my career in education 20 years ago as a 3rd grade teacher in Chicago, in the Chicago Public Schools, which is where I'm from originally. After teaching, working as an administrator, in 2017, I moved out to the Bay Area to San Francisco with my family. And that's when I started working with TNTP. We're a national nonprofit that partners with school districts across the country, kind of doing every kind of work you could imagine related to education. But the majority of my work here in the Bay Area, across California and specifically the Bay Area, is really focused on literacy and supporting teachers, supporting school leaders, supporting districts with shifting their literacy practices to focus on research-based practices. It's been a learning journey for me as well over the past 6 or 7 years on this topic. And so I'm really excited to be here. And I should have said this first and foremost, but I'll actually say it last, which is I'm a mother to 2 kids, a 3rd grader and a 4.5-year-old who is so excited for kindergarten. And so this topic is also super personal for me as a parent, as I watched my son learn to read in 2020 on Zoom in kindergarten, and I've watched my daughter begin the early stages of reading in preschool. So I'm very excited to be here. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Beth. Chanmi.
Hello, everyone. My name is Chanmi Chun, and I'm currently serving as a foundational skills literacy coach in Sunnyvale School District. So I'm here in the Bay Area, but it's been about 9 years I've been in the Bay Area. So I feel like it's home now, but it's funny that Beth, our paths are crossing here because I started 26 years ago in Chicago Public Schools. That's where I started my education journey. I feel like being a teacher was always in my blood. I was meant to be. I served in a school where there were 40 to 50 different language groups, and 90% free and reduced lunch. And so it was something where I was steeped in, and fully something that was a passion of mine, also for teaching English learners and students with learning needs and whatnot. And so being able to be in the position now to be able to provide instructional support for teachers to transition to this has been a passion of mine. I'm also a mother of 2 beautiful daughters who are in 8th grade and high school. And it's still actually interesting because my girls are always watching me. They're like, what are you doing all those hours on the laptop? And I'm like, well, I'm teaching teachers how to teach kids how to read. And they're like, oh, okay, you have to do that. I'm like, yeah, we do. And so it's something, and I'm actually still like using some of those things when my students are, my own children, I'm sorry, are putting that wrong emphasis on the wrong, putting the wrong emphasis on the wrong syllables as they're reading their higher level texts. And so this is a passion of mine for all students to be able to have the right to learn to read. That's just what they deserve when they go to schools. And so I'm excited that we have these sort of experiences for our parents.
Thank you, Chanmi. Jenessa.
Hi, I'm Jenessa Cheema. I work at Every Neighborhood Partnership. We're a local nonprofit in Fresno, California, so in the Central Valley. I'm the school support director, so that means that I help, with me and my team, help to train and equip local college students, church volunteers, and other community partners to do meaningful work on school campuses. And that includes a daytime literacy mentoring, which is like a one-on-one reading intervention that they do with kids in the classroom, a Read Fresno after school reading intervention program, and a Saturday sports recreational program. And then prior to this role, I was a 1st grade teacher in Memphis, Tennessee. So not Chicago, but somewhere else. And so I just know how hard our teachers work and how it really takes a community effort to see our kids succeed. And so, yeah, in all of our work, we just really try to help be extra support to our teachers, our families, and our kids all around literacy and recreation. So excited to be here.
Great. Kristen.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to join. I am also a 20-year classroom teacher in California. I did not teach in any other state, but I have been a classroom teacher, a reading interventionist, a literacy coach and TOSA, also a trainer and consultant. And much like my colleagues here, I came to this work out of a passion to improve literacy outcomes for kids. I started working when I stepped out of the classroom as a reading intervention teacher and did not know anything about the science of reading or structured literacy, and realized that all of my students had the same characteristics. And when I Googled those characteristics, I stumbled onto dyslexia, and that started that journey. And then realized that our family is touched by dyslexia, including my dad and my aunt, and then also my granddaughter. So on this journey, I think it's been really valuable to not only learn these practices and change my own practice, but help teachers understand and change their practice as well. In California, I've been lucky to volunteer for Decoding Dyslexia California as a longtime volunteer, and I'm currently excited to serve as the president of the newly launched Reading League California, which is another fantastic organization that supports this work. So thank you for the invitation to join.
Thank you, Kristen. And finally, Rebecca. Oh, you're on mute, Rebecca.
Sorry about that. Hi, everyone. I'm Rebecca Sutherland. I'm actually joining you from out of state today. I live in Denver, Colorado. I am the Associate Director of Research on an inclusive R&D program called Reading Reimagined. We are an inclusive R&D program that's supported by the Advanced Education Research and Development Fund. That's a mouthful. We go by AirDef. At Reading Reimagined, we are focused on ultimately developing solutions for kindergarten through 12th grade that will help teachers and parents to eradicate illiteracy within our lifetime. So not next year, but within our lifetime. And we think that that is an achievable goal. As the Associate Director of Research, I am leading a portfolio of researchers. Some of them are in universities. UC Irvine is one of them from California. and other independent researchers, as well as internal things that we are doing to develop literacy solutions. In particular, right now, we're focused on foundational skills for students in grades 3 through 8. If you're familiar with how reading instruction typically happens in American public schools, you get systematic, explicit instruction starting in kindergarten, or for some students in preschool, up to the end of 3rd grade. And the expectation is that by then you know how to read. But we know from many, many years of national assessment data and other pieces of evidence that our upper elementary, middle school, and high school students often cannot read, certainly at grade level. So we're focused on developing solutions that are developmentally appropriate for older students that will deliver instruction that they need in foundational skills. I've mentioned I'm in Denver. My background is in education research. I have my doctorate in human development and psychology, and I've worked at state education agencies, public school districts, and ed nonprofits that are focused on literacy. So I'm delighted to be part of this conversation, and thanks for having me.
Fantastic. This is just the lineup. I'm just so impressed by all of your backgrounds and so excited to learn from you all tonight. All right, so let us dive in. We're going to start by talking about phonemic awareness. And we hear a lot about phonics, but if you're not a teacher, or if you're not really steeped in all of this, you might never have even heard of phonemic awareness. I know until I became a teacher, literally had never heard of it in my life. So panelists, can you help us? What is phonemic awareness? Why is it important? And maybe also, how is it different from phonics? And Beth, could you help us with this part?
Sorry, I was having one of those mute moments where the mute button was not working. Yeah, so I'm glad you mentioned not knowing it, because I feel like this is an area too that, as an educator, often feels much more complicated than it might be. But phonemic awareness it's technically part of a larger term of phonological awareness, but really thinking about the ability. It's just a subset of phonological awareness. So this is when we are learning only how to identify and manipulate sounds without looking at them. So we're not reading words yet. We're understanding the how to identify and manipulate the units of language. That could be a syllable, could be a sound. And in phonemic awareness, we're really thinking just about those phonemes or the sounds, and how many sounds might be within a word, but not with looking at it, but just with listening to it. So I might be thinking of the word cat, and how many sounds or how many phonemes are within the word cat, and asking students to be able to break that apart based on the 3 sounds that they hear within that word. So I'll stop there and see if anybody else wants to add on a bit about phonemic awareness and what it looks like.
So why is this important? Like, why do we care if it's not looking at the words? Like, why do we care if kids can hear those sounds? This one can go for anyone, really.
I'm happy to jump in. This is a favorite topic of mine. So if you think about what the challenge of reading actually is, you're taking a visual representation that is not naturally produced by humans to represent the sounds of our speech. And those are things that we do have to learn to speak, but it's something that kids basically are learning to do without a whole lot of explicit instruction. So Beth mentioned earlier that sorry, I'm getting a public safety alert on my phone. I'm going to ignore it. Beth mentioned earlier that there's an umbrella of something called phonological awareness. And if you think of phonological awareness, this is just an analogy, but if you think about when toddlers, when babies are first interacting with the world, and they can see colors, right? They can absolutely discern different colors. And if you showed them 3 balls and 2 of them were red and 1 of them was blue, they would be able to identify the blue one as the one that's different just on the basis of color. They might not know the words. They might not know blue and red yet, but they can discern color. That kind of awareness, the awareness of how words sound, that words can rhyme, like nursery rhymes are taking advantage of the fact that you've got this, that hickory dickory dock, the mouse ran up the clock, that dock and clock are rhyming. Children might not know exactly what that rhyme means, but they can see the patterns. And that's phonological awareness. So that general ability to distinguish similarities and differences between words at the word level. And then, as Beth was mentioning, phonemic awareness is a subset of that skill, and it's more specific around the units of sound in a word. And the reason that this matters is that when you get to the task of either decoding, which is taking printed text that's representing spoken words, or encoding, which is writing or spelling words, you have to be able to map the sounds of a word onto the visual representations. In English, it's the alphabet. And so before you can do that mapping, that's called the alphabetic principle, before you can do the mapping of the sounds onto the letters, you have to have an awareness of the sounds. You have to hear, as Beth was saying, k, at, that's cat. Before you can take those individual sounds and say, oh, the k is represented by the C. That's what phonemic awareness does. It sets you up to be able to engage in that mapping of the sounds onto the letters.
Great, thank you. It's really helpful. So what does this look like in the classroom? How do teachers help their students, build this phonemic awareness? Chanmi, could you walk us through, like, what do you or what would your teachers be doing in the classroom to support this?
Yeah, I wanted to bridge actually what Rebecca and Beth had said, was that with phonemic awareness, though, it's also because speech is natural. And so we want to take what we know from science is that our brains are wired to hear like spoken language. So that's why we start with sounds. And the brain is actually not wired to read. And so physically, when we teach our kids when your child is learning to read, you're actually rewiring your brain and actually taking functions and changing them. And so it's amazing what you can see with the brain these days. And so teachers now are brain scientists too. And so they are, taking some parts of the brain that never were used to take this and unlock this code. So in your kindergarten class, if you have a kindergartner, they're going to start with the, level of like just isolating sounds. So like Rebecca had said, like, what are the sounds in the word? I mean, how many sounds, or the fancy word is phonemes, in the word cat? And you say, cat. And so they say there's 3 sounds, or there's 3 phonemes. Or you can also say, like, what's the first sound in the word bear? And you say, bear. So those are the kind of things that you'll hear in the classrooms. Those are kind of things you could do at home. Your first grader is going to get a little more sophisticated. And then they're going to be able to like identify what's the first sound. That's actually the easiest. Then the last sound, and the hardest is the middle sound. That's actually really hard. And they're going to learn how to isolate them, but also to blend them together. And so if your child might be learning to like finger stretch or to finger tap their sounds. And so they say, let's say the word cat. And so then blend it together. Cat. So that might be something that you might start having your child like do and represent that. And then in second grade above is what they
Tommy,
said
could you speak a little bit louder? I got some things in the chat saying you're a little bit quiet.
I'm sorry about that.
There you go.
Is that better? Okay.
Yes.
And the last thing in second grade is that and end of first grade to second grade is when they're manipulating. And that's actually the very hardest skill. But that's going to be the skill that says like it's glued, like the words are starting to like cement in the orthographic mapping. That means that we have this letter file box. And when you're able to manipulate sounds, that means you're going to be able to add a sound, you can delete a sound or substitute a sound. So if I say, let's take out the sound in the word switch, what's the new word? The new word is which. And then let's take the middle sound and let's replace the is sound with an or ah, and then you say swatch. So it's like that's manipulation. And that actually, once your child is at that level, that's when it's like the words will just explode in their heads and they'll just be able to understand sounds really well. And so that's actually what we want to shoot for in terms of their goals for being able to bridge into phonics.
Great. It's really helpful. And so what if you're not a teacher, right? You're a parent or a caregiver and you want to try to help your child with these early skills. What are some things that parents or families could do to try to support phonemic awareness or phonological awareness with their kids? Jenessa, do you have any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think at the basic level, it starts, we always say talk, read, sing. Like, I think we've talked, all of this is about hearing the different sounds. And so the more sounds kids are hearing just in talking, just in singing, just in hearing you read a book or read whatever it is, that is all helpful. But then if you want to take it to the next level, I found this really great resource on reading rockets, and I'll put it in the chat. But it was made for families, has some different ideas. It's really a lot of silly games. And so like even the silly game of, is your name Chelsea? Is your name Melcy? No, it's not Melcy. Is it Celcy? No. Is it Delcy? No, my name's Kelsey. Like you're just making up. So, you know, if your child's name is Kelsey, you're changing that first letter sound and they get to hear all these different sounds and make up silly words with that. It gives lots of different ideas, but even like I spy something that starts with the k sound. Do you see it? Where is it? K, k, k. Oh, is it the TV? Does TV start with k? No. How about, is it the dog? No, k, k. Oh, it's the candy. Like, so playing I spy, playing around with different words. So kind of like going with what Chanmi was saying, like you could say, I'm thinking of an animal that rhymes with the word big. What animal rhymes with big? Is it dog? Does that rhyme with big? No. Is it cat? Oh, it's on a farm. Oh, it's pig. Pig and big, those rhyme. Can you think of anything else that rhymes with pig and big? And like, you know, you've got wig and fig. And so just basic fun little games like that that you could do riding in the car, play I Spy as you're driving, play, yeah, simple, easy, fun games like that. But that link has a few more ideas too.
And Reading Rockets is just a great website in general. You can find a million things to do as a parent to support your child's reading on that website for sure. Thank you. Any other thoughts about phonemic awareness or phonological awareness, panelists? Anything we want our parents to know?
I will jump in with the reminder that for students who, for children, for people who have characteristics of dyslexia, this phonemic awareness skill is one of the first red flags that you might see. So when a child persistently mispronounces a word, and the classic is Paschetti or library, those are common and typical in early speech development, but if it persists in your child, that's a red flag. And then some of this manipulation that's been so terrifically described, the inability to do that, if it persists toward the end of kindergarten, well into first grade, that's also a red flag. A student today that I was working with puts it at the end of every segmented word. So the word would be hill, and she'd say it, and the word would be guys, and she'd say g-I-t. So looking for those mismatches can be a warning sign to pay attention to, and to maybe ask more questions about from your school staff.
Great. Great. So if you're seeing these kinds of red flags, what should you do? What would be advice for, especially in these early steps, if you're starting to see some red flags that you're worried about? Any thoughts on that out there?
Yeah, if you're a teacher in the classroom, you are going to start whatever process, lots of us call it SST, but some sort of student study process that allows you to collect some data, benchmark where that student's skills are, provide some explicit intervention, teach to that skill and see if you can improve it. That rate of improvement or lack of improvement will help you talk to then your school site team about next steps for either tier 2 intervention or referrals for testing, or whatever the process is. But don't wait. And don't wonder, well, maybe it'll get better next month. Really intervene quickly and precisely in a targeted way.
And I want to add that, like, it's not just a gut feeling of the teacher, or your gut feeling is ask for data, like ask for them to, what assessments are you using? Because we want to know, actually, there's been these big shifts in education and how we teach our kids how to read in our schools in the last 5 years. And some districts haven't made the shift quite yet, or schools haven't been able to make the shift quite yet. So we want to make sure that we really accurately identify, is this because they haven't had exposure to the correct instruction? Or is it because there's actually they've had the true instruction with science-based evidence instruction, and then they just haven't, your child hasn't been making the growth. So we just want to make sure there's a difference between those two, is that it's first the correct instructional process, make sure that correct instruction is there. And then if that is in place, then most likely they have some data. They want to be able to assess how their kids are doing. That's what teachers will do, is they want to know if what they're teaching is sticking. And so if it's not sticking, then they know they have to either continue and reteach or whatnot. So that's something that you can be asking for, is can you tell me what skills my child knows and what skills my child still needs?
Right. All right, with this kind of frame still going on, because I think this will apply for our next set of questions as well, but shifting over to the big world of phonics. Phonics we probably all heard of more than phonemic awareness, but what exactly is it? And why is it so important? Why is it so much part of the conversations that we're hearing right now? And Beth, could you help us with that one? Oh, not Beth, sorry. I put you on the spot for one of those. How about Rebecca this time?
Make sure I'm unmuted this time before I start talking. Right, so if phonemic awareness is the necessary precursor to being able to map sounds onto printed text, then phonics is the actual process of making that mapping explicit. So phonemic awareness is, something that actually doesn't involve your vision at all. Phonemic awareness you can do with your eyes closed, because phonemic awareness is about the sounds of speech and being able to isolate the individual sounds. But phonics is about being able to take those sounds and represent them in text, or if you're seeing the text, being able to reproduce them into sound. So if you see BAT, you can say that to yourself or say that out loud and say, but at bat. That is the process of phonics. Usually phonics instruction, typically, especially for kids in kindergarten through 2nd or 3rd grade, is focused on 1 and 2 syllable words. And we can come back to that later, Molly, if you want to. But it's a big challenge. And that's why a few years of elementary school are dedicated to learning phonics, learning how to decode text.
So we heard a little bit about this last spring when we were having these sessions. And one of the things that kept coming up was people saying it needs to be systematic and explicit. But what does that mean? What does it mean for we need to have this phonics and these other foundational skills be taught systematically, explicitly? Kristen, could you help us with that one?
Yeah, I love this question. Thank you for asking. So you can't talk about systematic and explicit instruction without talking a little bit about researcher and author Anita Archer. Her classic line is, I do it, we do it, you do it. So we're talking about instruction that is direct and explicit and leaves nothing to chance. It will also typically follow a scope and sequence, right? And that scope and sequence is from most common to least common and from easier to more complex. And that scope and sequence is a page or two, especially when it comes to phonics. So you don't need 6 pages of a scope and sequence. It's very tight, it's very controlled. And then there's lots of practice and repetition so that I do it, I show you how to do it, we do it together, then I give you independent practice, and I'm quick to correct errors. So we don't practice mistakes. We get in there and correct those mistakes. And these are key components of structured literacy, or some people come to it first through an Orton-Gillingham approach. So some teachers might have learned Orton-Gillingham first, which is a form of structured literacy, but you have that component embedded into the phonics instruction.
And so how is this different from balanced literacy, which some of our districts, West Contra Costa, uses balanced literacy, for example. What's the difference there? I know it's a big question, but Kristen, could you want to start that one?
Yes, ma'am. No, every week my granddaughter brings home a weekly spelling test, and it contains all of the representations of long O. So O and OE and O silent E, and it's overwhelming, and it's too much information for her to master or absorb. I think for me, and I would invite the panelists to talk too, balanced literacy is just more of a smattering of this phonics content, and it's not taught to mastery or explicitly. It also can involve things that really don't build the reading brain, like opening an anthology and just doing choral reading or a group reading together, where that's really not learning to read. It's something different. I feel like I've been away from it so long now that it's harder for me to describe it too.
Yeah. Beth, looks like you have something to add here.
Well, I was going to share another thing too. I agree with what you've shared. And I also think in some cases there may be schools, with a balanced literacy approach that do have some systematic foundational skills instruction that also may not be necessarily for as much time as we would hope, that should be covered every single day, or maybe not for all students. Maybe just some students get that instruction and other students don't. And so I think that is definitely a case where if you know that that's the approach that your child's school is using, asking some questions to learn a bit more about, so we are a balanced literacy school. What does the foundational skills instruction look like? Because it may be present. It may be present to a great extent. It may only be present for a small amount of the day of the literacy block, which is usually a common challenge in some schools with that approach.
Right.
If I could add, and so the problematic aspect of that balanced literacy is the leveled reader text being used to be able to build those foundational reading skills. And so it's founded on this work of like the 3 cueing system, and it starts with meaning, then it goes to syntax, which is like how the word fits within the sentence, and then what they have for visual, which is like a graphic phonic. And you think, oh, I hear graphic phonic, but it actually misses the big point of what we wanted to start with, is the phonological awareness. And so that piece of not being, can you hear me by the way?
That's better
now?
when you hold
okay.
close. Yeah.
Sorry about that. Our brain is working really hard when it learns to read, and it actually has to start with knowing the sounds in the words and the letters of the words, and it goes up to meaning, and then like the context in which it learns. These are these processes going on, and the meaning and syntax and visual with the 3 cueing is actually going backwards, and it's going with the context before the word recognition. And you cannot start with the context first, because then it encourages kids to just guess. And then what's problematic about the type of text is the leveled readers. And so you have, especially your young ones, K and first, kindergarten, first grader, they might be, looks like they're reading because they're reading these pattern predictable texts, like I like my cat, I like my horse, but there's no way a kindergartner can read the word horse, be able to decode it yet without that explicit instruction, because there's a lot going on with the word horse. And so if your child is reading the word horse, it just might be they're reading the pattern or looking at the picture to guess, or saying, hey, look at the first letter. What do you think the word means? And so it could fill in the blank. I like my mom, and it's probably not a mom, it's probably a horse, so it could be something like that. So really, that's the aspect of balanced literacy. And that doesn't mean that the 3 cueing system, like there are some things that, like we said, we know better now with how our brains learn to read, but that's the one aspect of it that is missing in supporting our kiddos to have that strong foundation in knowing how to read, is that sound knowledge first, and then being able to understand and bridge it to phonics.
Thank you. So Rebecca, we've been mostly talking about, kindergarten, first grade here in this part of the discussion, but I know you said you are doing some work with older kids and these kinds of skills. What do older kids need in terms of this, or what are you finding?
Well, it's a complicated story because, of course, we have some students in upper elementary and middle school and high school who never received systematic, explicit phonics instruction in the first place, or they didn't have enough of it. But for one reason or another, they are not decoding even 1 and 2 syllable words with accuracy and consistency. So that's one group of students who have unmet learning needs in upper grades. But then, if you look at the national reading data, not just in recent years, so this is not just a phenomenon of COVID instruction or anything like that, going back quite some time, we have low rates of proficiency. The highest rates we tend to see in 4th grade, that 4th graders year after year, when they're taking tests, national tests, we see like 1/3 to 40% of them reading proficiently, and then it goes down after that. Why? So there was a paper put together by the Educational Testing Service that came out in 2019 that looked at a unique data set. It's unique because it, very unusually, tests foundational skills of older students. Usually schools do not test foundational skills of 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th graders, but this data set had that. And they saw that students who were below a threshold value on decoding, regardless of how much comprehension support they received, their comprehension scores did not improve. So low decoding ability, it's not that surprising when you think about it, but we usually don't measure it, makes comprehension inaccessible for students. So again, some of them probably never had adequate phonics instruction, but we think that there's a probably larger group of students whose decoding needs lie around things that phonics usually doesn't cover, and that's multisyllabic words, for example. So as you go up into elementary school, you start to have discipline-specific text that has specialized vocabulary like xylophone or photosynthesis, and the skills that you learn in basic phonics instruction aren't going to help you so much with those words, especially because they're words that tend to have roots coming from languages like Latin and Greek, and that isn't covered in our basic phonics instruction. So there is an ongoing need in upper elementary school, in middle school, for explicit support for decoding. Again, because some of the students didn't get adequate phonics instruction in K through 2 or 3, but because many others of them might have basic phonics down, but they aren't ready to accurately decode words that have many syllables and roots that are coming from languages other than English.
Very interesting. So taking some of this like big knowledge here about what we're doing in the classroom, research, what can our families do? How can families support their students in developing these decoding skills? That's a big question there, but Beth, could you help give us some ideas to start?
Yeah, I think, I always think one of the best places to start is, asking questions from a place of learning and wanting to support your child to their teacher, to have a sense of, what sound are they learning that week? What is the focus? And hopefully, in an ideal world, there's some sort of regular communication from your child's teacher each week or every few weeks that shares some of the things that they're learning. And this is a great thing that for teachers to include. I cannot remember if my son got this in 2020 because I try not to remember a lot of that time, but my daughter in preschool now, we know what letter they're working on each week, and it's posted outside the classroom, and that's something that I ask her about, that we talk about at home. She finds objects that start with that letter, and so just thinking about the communications with with teachers, so that when you're aware of what they're focused on, if they're following a systematic scope and sequence, then they're going to be learning sounds that build on the ones they learned previously, and they're going to be learning the right sounds that will help them to make words, so that they're not just learning, 6 consonants and that they can't spell a word with, but they've learned a vowel so they can start making words. And so as you know the skills that that your children are learning, then a lot of these things that we talked about that can happen, previously all orally, can start to translate to words and to what they're able to read, or words they're able to make out of, objects or from writing at home. So I'll pause there and see if anybody else wants to add on.
Yeah, totally exactly what you said. But I would say at a real basic level, if they're doing their homework and they're like, how do I spell that? Instead of just telling them how to spell that thing, like encourage them, oh, what sounds do you hear in that? And if the word's pizza and they're like, pizza, I think not expecting them to be able to spell all of pizza out, depending on their age level, but like at least they got the P down, they heard a P and they heard a sound in there, and maybe they didn't quite know it was Z. But so I think at a basic level, them just realizing how, like, listening to them as they're trying to sound out a word, can they hear some of those sounds in there? And then maybe asking the teacher, like, I noticed when we were trying to write pizza, they only heard the P and a S and a U. They heard pizza. Is that right? Is that where they should be at? Should they know more than that by now? And then the teacher, based on their grade level, can let you know, like, that's spot on. They're hearing some sounds, or they can let you know, hey, by 5th grade, we should be hearing more sounds than that. Or so I think that's a practical note.
That's great advice. Chanmi.
I think we didn't clarify too, like the difference between phonemic awareness and phonics. And so when we start with sounds, it's like, where do the letters come in? Because the kids have to be able to read. And so phonics then is when you take the knowing the sounds, and then what are the matching letters or letter combinations? Because English has 26 letters, but we have these 44 sounds in English, and they're all different combinations. And so, for example, when you have the word light, you have this sound in the middle, I, and like, oh, do you use the letter I? No, actually, you're going to use a different letter a little cluster of letters. IGH is going to give you that same sound. So this is why we do start with sounds, but then, like what Jenessa had mentioned is, I wouldn't want your child, don't spell for your child. Really get a sense of like what they're hearing in their writing, because that, we call it invented spelling, but it also just kind of tells you from their writing, like what phase they're in terms of their development. And then saying, hey, this was an authentic piece of writing. And so this is where I'm seeing this, like asking a teacher, which phase do you think they're in? What do you think, what skills are you working on right now that you think? The teacher should be doing this, but if you also notice it at home and you just want that information, you can say like, yeah, pizza, 3rd grader might know that this is, that you hear so many sounds in pizza, so it's like, are they adding extra sounds too? Because English also, you can sometimes add too many sounds with the schwa. So instead of the word feet and saying eat, there's only 3 sounds, and the graphemes, there's only 3 graphemes too. E, but the grapheme, the spelling is with a double E and a T. But then if you add some extra sounds like fa, he, ta, then it's fajita, not a feet. So that's why you want to make sure that like you're not adding extra sounds too when you're practicing those sounds with your kiddos too. That's something that will help with the blending eventually later too. But phonics is that's a really hard one to support at home. So you would really want to partner with your teacher in your school to be able to do this, because it really takes a lot of science to know like what's the appropriate sequence and whatnot. So don't feel like the burden has to be on you to know this, is that, put the task on your schools to be able to support you on this.
That's great. All right, let's turn to a little bit of time on fluency. So first, let's keep going to like, what is fluency in the context of reading? What do we mean by that what is reading fluency? And again, why do we care about that? Who wants to start us with that one? Rebecca. gonna keep asking you these ones, but you're so good with the definitions there.
Sure, sure. No, I'm happy to, because 4 of the research projects that Reading Reimagined is supporting are the development and pilots of fluency protocols that teachers in 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th grade can use with their classes. So fluency is once you've got students who are able to decode text, so they can read sentences, they can read paragraphs. But if you've ever listened to a developing reader, it is sometimes pretty choppy or very monotone. So they are decoding the words. They're translating the letters that are on the page into the sounds of the words. But it's not necessarily fluent enough to really indicate that they're comprehending what they're reading. And so fluency is a practice that is happening out loud. So the students are reading out loud and the teacher is listening. The teacher can be modeling. Sometimes you'll do multiple passes through a given page of text where students might initially listen to the teacher while they follow along, and then everyone does a choral reading together. And then you could have students work in pairs and do partner reading. So there are different fluency practices, but this is a really important skill that, again, with my focus on students in upper elementary and middle school, this is an ongoing need. Teachers in upper elementary and middle schools typically are not trained to give this kind of instructional support to students because we think that explicit reading instruction ends in 3rd grade. So your typical 7th grade science teacher might really want all of her students to be reading the science textbook out loud so the class can learn together, but does not know necessarily exactly what to do to support a student who cannot read out loud fluently. So fluency is that bridging process between decoding and comprehension, and a student's ability to represent the text back into spoken words with the right, so they're not sounding like a robot and they're not stumbling over the words and sounding out every word that they encounter. Those are indicators of a student that still needs more practice with reading. Maybe they have some ongoing decoding issues, but the fluency that we expect to see is fluency that is not perfectly replicating a spontaneous speech, but is sounding more like speech than it is like you're laboriously reading word by word or letter by letter.
Great, thank you. That's really helpful. Jenessa, I think you were telling me that you do fluency work. Your tutors do some fluency passages. Is that right in your program? What do they do to help build that fluency with their students?
Yeah, for our students who are reading at like a 3rd through 6th grade level, we do some fluency practices. And that looks like really it's one-on-one support. So really reading with the child, listening to them read, providing corrective feedback right in the moment. So like helping them as they're struggling through words, or even like, hey, did that make sense? You want to reread that sentence? I think you missed a word. So giving them corrective feedback so they can reread as they move along. Yeah, and that's the number one thing that helps, is reading out loud to an adult and having them give you corrective feedback, or to a peer, is the number one thing that will help you improve your fluency. So yeah.
Great. And for parents, parents can do that, or other ideas of how parents or caregivers, without training. Phonics is so technical, but fluency is a little more approachable, it seems like. What could families do to support with fluency in their kids? Kristen.
Yeah, I love these answers. Like, they've hit on the same things that you can try at home. So reading aloud, getting corrective feedback. One of the other features that can help is seeing yourself grow as the reader. So if the parent selected a favorite book and the child could read that book aloud, they could read it one night and then they could read it the next night, and then they could get a little farther each time. At school, we would probably introduce some sort of timed element, maybe for 30 seconds or a minute, but it might not be so fun at home, and that would feel a lot like school. So, but repeating a reading, even though your kids roll their eyes, I read this last night, they can do it again, and then you can point out for them how much farther they went the second time. Echo reading is really good. The parent can read with expression and prosody, and then the student can copy. Or if a student reads a particular sentence or phrase in sort of a flat affect, the parent can model for them with expression and punctuation, and then have the student copy. So just doing those sort of mimicky type things at home is helpful, and let your student, your child know that you're interested, that you're there to support them, and that they can do it. And so they hear that from you at home, and then they hear it at school, and that can really build that fluency and the confidence.
Great, great. Let's turn to a few broader questions here. So one is, we keep hearing throughout today about these great instructional practices, right? The structured literacy, the systematic instruction, the using the data. If a parent or family member wants to figure out if their school or their district or their teacher are using these best practices, what can they do, or what kinds of questions could they ask, or what could they look for if they get the opportunity, to visit a classroom and see what's going on there? Chanmi, do you have thoughts about this? Or I know there's a resource I remember that you were sharing as well.
There's a resource that I was able to curate, some questions that you can ask that of these 5 areas, the pillars. But I think just generally you want to make sure that the approach is from sounds to letters, right? So you can be asking, like, do you start off with learning more sounds and doing some phonic? You can be fancy and say, do you start with phonemic awareness? And that before you go into, instead of like a letter a week, like A, B, C, in sequential order from A to Z, like we want to move away from that. And if, you can say, like, is there a scope and sequence of what my kids are going to learn for foundational skills? Can you tell me what they're going to be learning this year? And do all the students learn these skills? So is it just in a small group, or do all children have that for a good chunk of time? About 15 to 20 minutes is really the standard amount of time. And you think like that's so short, but actually it takes a lot of mental strength to learn these skills. And so 15, 20 minutes every day with practice in small group eventually is really all the practice that your child needs. And then just what assessments are there? So if they're using assessments to be able to track, like, how is what they're learning sticking, is what they're teaching sticking, that's kind of a good indicator too, that like they're trying to see, like, what patterns do the students know, and where are they moving forward in their making progress.
Right. Any other thoughts about look fors or questions, just to get an understanding of what our students are learning?
Yeah, I just to continue a little bit of the helpful advice that Chanmi was offering. I think, seems to me, I don't have children myself, so I want to name that. But I've worked in schools and with teachers for a long time, and I think that if I were trying to get a sense, and don't have technical knowledge myself about learning to read, I would just ask the teacher, like, for her, 4-sentence philosophy about learning to read, like especially in kindergarten and first grade. And I would expect to hear, just as Chanmi was saying, it's hard. It's hard for kids to learn to read. And I would want to hear a teacher give some kind of acknowledgement of that, and to emphasize the importance of foundational skill learning and the mechanics of learning to read. If instead you're just hearing about, I want all of the kids to love to read. I mean, that's important. Loving to read is great. But if that's all they're saying, it's hard to tell what they're doing instructionally based on lovely sentiments. So that's something that I think anyone could do, and you'll not have to use words like phonemic awareness to ask the question.
Great.
Actually, I wanted to jump in to say that the loving to read part is from you at home. And so I know that, like, they had mentioned something about giving feedback to your child, but I'm going to just tell you, I'm a teacher. My own children do not like getting feedback from me. So you do not have to be the reading police for your child. And so your job is to find the books that they want to read, whether it's a graphic novel or it's a sports newspaper, whatever they want to read, if they're wanting to do it. And it could also be an audiobook too. So that like love of reading and getting something that they're really interested in, that's your job. So the love and the like all happy feelings, the teacher needs to teach them how to read so they will love to read. So if that's being done at school, then your child will want to read and will be curious about it. And so that's your job. So I know that the feedback that we could provide, my kids will roll their eyes at me if I give them any feedback. So you just say, you do your thing. Let's just read this much together. And during the pandemic, even though my kids could read, we read the Harry Potter series together, and it was so fun. Make it a fun experience. And because there's so much going on when you do it orally as a family too. So your kid doesn't have to be reading like to you, you could be reading to them too, and that will also help them. And do it in your native language, your first language too. Does not have to be in only English. More languages they hear, the more sounds they hear, that's actually even better too. So if you can teach them how to like listen in your own native language, that would be their first language, that would be amazing as well.
Great. All right, one last question is, it's kind of a big one. If your school, if your district is not there yet, and you have concerns based on what you're hearing about, any advice for what family members or teachers struggle with this too, if their school's not there yet, or their district's not there yet, or their curriculum? Any thoughts about like, what can we do if we're worried?
A lot of people coming off mute for this one. I think there's so much power in the voice of parents coming together and sharing your personal stories to anyone and everyone who will listen. I think that's what's, really been powerful in bringing about change in many, many districts and many places across the country, across the Bay Area. And so I think that as much as, you feel comfortable sharing the challenges that you may have seen because of a lack of systematic instruction in your child's classroom, and the concerns that you have, and, the having other parents by your side, and if it is the case of having other teachers as well, to really just share the concern. And the concern, this is such a huge equity issue and social justice issue across our country for all of our students, and there's such power in parents being the ones to really voice the need for this change. So I know it, as a parent myself, it is not easy, but it is so necessary. And you may not feel like you are listened to initially, but that is how change is really happening in many districts.
I will piggyback off of that. I am not naive. I know and have met with many angry parents, and rightly so. With that caveat, I will also say that my overarching umbrella is relationships, relationships, relationships. And so if you're a parent, establishing a relationship with the principal, and then reaching out to a curriculum director or a board member. If you're a teacher and you're an early adopter, relationships with your colleagues. I like to ask, where are you on your journey in the science of reading? How did you learn about it? What do you know so far? What do you still want to learn? I like to ask decision makers, can I send you an article? I have this really great book. There's this webinar that I watched. There's a podcast that I listen to. Every principal that I've had for the last 5 years gets Natalie Wexler books for Christmas. And so, but you have to open that door and get in there and stay persistent and positive and diligent, and share that message and, help people move along on that journey. So I like that part too.
Great, thank you. All right, we have a few questions in our Q&A. We're running a little bit low on time, so we're gonna do kind of like the quick, fast, speed dating version of these ones. And let me see. One question, how do these foundational skills differ if a student is in a dual language program? We're gonna do a whole session kind of on English learners in a couple of weeks, but any quick thoughts, since we know a lot of our families here don't necessarily have English as their language at home, or in dual language programs.
Can I hop
Chanmi.
on that one? Because
Yes,
we have
please.
one of our schools is actually a dual language school. We have a Spanish dual language program, and so the instruction is in Spanish first, kindergarten through second grade, Now Spanish is one of those languages that can bridge pretty easy to English, because you have some sounds that can actually bridge over to English, and then there's some that don't. So, but whatever language the first language is there, I would ask the district, when is it going to transition? Where you're going to have that sound awareness and now unlocking the code of English language versus the first language that they're learning. And even if it's Chinese or Asian language, these are still sound-based languages. And so your child, even though they may have different letters, I would say, or to transcribe that, it still should transfer over, and just knowing how to bridge that and what is the plan for doing that as well. So make sure you ask that.
Great, thank you. And then we're going to dive even more deeply into this in a couple of weeks, if you're wondering about this, because it's a big, complicated topic for sure. Here's a kind of more specific question coming from our discussion on fluency. Allison asks, what are some strategies to get students to echo you modeling fluency, but keeping their eyes on the text, not just memorizing when we're doing these echo reads or fluency reads? Any thoughts on that?
Pointing.
Kristen?
Yeah, put your finger under the word so that you can see that they're tracking and matching one-to-one. Yeah, that's one.
Yeah, love it. It's simple, but real for sure. Here's another one. What do you tell parents in terms of early readers? And I think by that they're meaning some of those like predictable text. I see an elephant, I see a zebra, that kind of book.
I think Chanmi kind of mentioned it earlier when she was talking about leveled readers, but I think you want to look for decodables would be a key word. And that's going to help you find words. You want books that are mostly all words that can be decoded. So simple. And if you look up, yeah, I'd say decodables is your keyword. They won't all be perfect, but that's a start. Yeah.
I would name, there's the series, the Bob books, that are really helpful, that they're not perfect, but they can clearly see what has been taught. So if you know what your children have learned, then that's a great series to look at, you can then map what they have learned to what's in those specific books. And they're really silly, but kids love them.
I will say, as a mom, those are the ones my kids learn to read on.
Mm-hmm. And there are free decodable texts resources out there. But remember that decodable texts then are the skills that your child should have already learned in school, and then they're practicing it in the text. That's another difference in using these decodable texts too.
Kind of a related question that came from one of our RSVPs when they registered was, we used to know, like, my kid's reading at level J or level P, or we get this like number that would tell us like what level that they're at, and you could go to the library and get a book at that level, or you could go to Barnes and Noble. Now that's not exactly what we're doing. So how can parents help get the right books for their kids? Any thoughts on that one?
One thought, I think it goes back to what also Chanmi said earlier, is like just letting kids pick what they want to read. So I think starting there, like letting them pick what they want to read, and even if it's too hard of a book, like help them through it. Like read it together. Even going back to that fluency question, like part of that is just reading together as they point, like, let's read this book together, or I'll read a sentence, you read a sentence. And so if it's something they're really invested in and want to read, they'll put in the effort, even if it's a little harder.
There's a reason why libraries are not leveled, like even classroom libraries and real libraries we walk into are not leveled, because that's not the way the world works. And so those levels actually don't even really accurately indicate like what they know how to, the phonics skills that they know. And so, we don't want letters with the books. We want them to pick something that they're going to enjoy reading with the support with you, or with audio support or whatnot. So just keeping that in mind in the classrooms. If you're a teacher, you have levels, like your library is based on levels. We need to make the practice of motivating the kids to read, because motivation is a huge issue, especially for our reluctant readers. And so they want to be motivated by the things that they're interested in. And we really want to be culturally responsive and have diverse options in the classroom where the kids feel seen in the classroom, and also in the books that they read. And there's a lot of amazing options now for authors that write that are diverse.
Great. Why don't I just open up now to what are any last kind of thoughts about any of these great topics? Because I know you all have so much more you could say, but what are your last thoughts that you want to leave our families and teachers and community members with um, tonight?
I had seen a few more questions in the chat that were asked in Spanish originally. I just wanted to make sure we address those too. The professional who does the evaluation for dyslexia,
Great,
that'd be
thank
at your
you.
school site. But Kristen, you want to take it? You're the expert here. So you take that one. I just want to make sure we address it.
Thank you,
Yeah,
Jenessa.
the assessment, excuse me, in a school setting would be done by the school psychologist and the resource teacher. They would give a battery of tests that would indicate the reading disability and the characteristics that support that disability. So you can get that done there. Schools don't diagnose, they identify. So you might hear them shy away from that language, but they're still providing an assessment that will give you the indicators of dyslexia or a different reading disability.
And in our fourth session in early November, we are going to be focusing all on these reading difficulties and disabilities and dyslexia as our topic. So there's a lot to unpack there, but we will give even more information then. All right, any last thoughts before we start some of our wrap up?
There was one question very early on about reading and memorization.
Hmm.
And so if you do, the one thing you don't want to hear a teacher say is that reading is memorization. We don't actually read by looking at the whole word and sticking it in our brain. It does not work that, or pictures, because then that doesn't even work. And so making sure that you know that they're able to know the sounds. And so memorizing flashcards, those kind of things, that's really not a practice that really is going to teach your child to read. So it's not anything faulty with your child if they're sitting there drilling and killing with tons of things, because that is not how they're going to learn to read. So trust yourself. It's not a memorization issue. This is then like they need to know the phonics pattern or the reading foundational skill.
All right. So we will be sharing out with you some more resources in a moment, and we can also be sharing out this video later to see this again. But first I want to announce we have our 2 raffle winners for tonight. We have Gabriella Lara from the Central Valley and Lois Mandel from New Jersey. We've got people from all over the place tonight, which is so exciting. So look out for an email to get some more information about how to get that. And now I'm going to start talking us through some of our last pieces. So first, one thing that we are building here at Go is a online literacy library. We're putting together a series of one-pagers for a bunch of different topics to help you be able to access this information and links to lots of resources. So we have our first few of these available tonight. What is the science of reading? We have a literacy glossary that breaks down a lot of this language that we've been talking about tonight. And also one, how to support your child with growing as a reader, which has a lot of practical links. And there's more topics coming soon. So stay tuned. We'll be posting these to our website. Next, I want to make sure you know about some of our sessions coming up. So next week, next Wednesday, we have a special guest, Natalie Wexler, who made a huge difference in my own teaching and when I was an instructional coach. So I'm really excited to get to talk to her and learn from her. She'll be talking about comprehension and writing and where they fit into the science of reading. And register for that one. We'll be giving away a bunch of copies of The Knowledge Gap, which is her fantastic book on this topic. So we can't wait for that one. And it's the same RSVP link that you use for this. And then we have a few more sessions coming up, which I've mentioned. On October 24th, we'll be talking about how this all applies to English learners and how to build literacy not just in English, but also in your home language, so we can have really biliterate or multiliterate children and adults in our country and state. And then November 9th, we'll be diving into dyslexia, reading needs, disabilities, and how to navigate questions if you're concerned that something doesn't seem to be quite right yet, and some things that you can do. We've got some great panelists lined up for that, including some folks from Decoding Dyslexia California, including Kareem Weaver, including people from districts and some parents. So that will be a great one. So we would love to see you at any and all of these. Also, in the meanwhile, if you're having concerns about your student and whether or not they do need extra support or they do need an evaluation or assessment, you can turn to our Parents Guide to Special Education. This is written, parts of it were written specifically for West Contra Costa, but a lot of it applies more in general for talking about what are your rights as a parent or as a student, what are some of the different laws, what are all these many, many acronyms that you'll come across in the world of special education and intervention. And this is available in both English and in Spanish. And finally, if you're in West Contra Costa, we do have some in-person events coming up soon, which will be our College Early and Often program. Our next sessions of those is going to be about vocational careers and vocational education. So if you're in West Contra Costa, these will be in person in Richmond, and we have different ones for different grade bands. So sign up for those. That one has a different link and a different QR code for those. And then for our friends in Fresno, the Every Neighborhood Partnership Program that our fabulous Jenessa is a part of is recruiting more literacy mentors. So this is a commitment to work about once a week with a student or two, and you get training on how to do this and to put a lot of what we've been hearing today in practice. And there's programming in both English and in Spanish. So you can go to their website to find out how to get more involved if you are in Fresno. All right, and that's it. Thank you all so much. I know I have learned so much tonight. I have so many ideas, and I'm just so grateful to our panelists for sharing your wisdom and knowledge. And for our parents, this is one of the hardest times of day. I know you've got hungry children in the background. You probably just came home from work, or you might even still be there. So thank you for making the time, and hopefully we will see you next week.